Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, the Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, coming to you from Central California, and I'm the author of a whole bunch of novels and a few nonfiction books.
Molly?
Oh, sorry. I'm Molly Joe. I am social media ninja, producer of this podcast, and a writer.
Excellent.
And I'm Heather Luby. I'm a writer, a freelance editor, and an instructor with the St. Louis Writers Workshop.
Super excited to have you back, Heather. Many of you are familiar, of our listeners are familiar with Heather. You've heard her wonderful, illustrious voice before. She always brings some great wisdom to our podcast. So she's joining us tonight to talk about the 7 deadly writing sins. Ooh, sounds dangerous. But first, as always, Pops, you have the publishing term of the day.
I do. I'm going to give 2 terms today because they're kind of related. One is OP, and the reason I'm talking about this is I'm working on republishing one of my first novels, my second novel, as a matter of fact. OP stands for out of print. Sometimes you will see it as OOP, out of print, giving us all of them, but usually it's just OP, and that's what a publisher does when they don't want to print any more books. They don't think they're going to be able to sell them, so rather than put them into warehouses, those that still use warehouses, they're just not going to continue to promote the book anymore. So it goes out of print. That doesn't mean there's no copies around, and they will usually offer you the opportunity to buy the remaining 500 copies or whatever it is at a discounted rate. But the book isn't going to be published anymore. Now, don't confuse that with our next term, return of rights. Return of rights is different. Return of rights is where the publisher gives back the rights to your book to you. Usually we think the writer, since we have the copyright, we own the rights to the book. We don't. Publishers have them. And they have an exclusive right to it until they give it back to you. So return of rights, so you find it in your contract, find out when you can do that. Often you have to wait till you get the notice of out of print, and then you have to write them for most publishers and request, or your agent does, and request a return of rights, and sometimes they don't give it. Believe it or not, I've got I think my 3rd and 4th book I can't get back, even though it's technically out of print. They won't give me the rights back, so that happens sometimes. So there you go, out of print. Every publisher, every writer has a great fear of out of print, and then also they want their rights back so they can do something else with them, like sell them or self-publish, that sort of thing.
Now, you've done that with a couple of your books, right, Pops? The rights have been returned to you and you've self-published them, is that correct?
Yeah, I've done that with some new stuff, but I've also done it with, and mostly with my out-of-print material. And the idea is, especially my earlier books were almost 2 decades ago, and of course some newer ones, the idea is to build a new audience. There's a lot of people that haven't had a chance to read them, and you make a little money. You're not looking to sell 15,000 copies. If it happens, woohoo, it's cruise time to the Mexican Riviera. But if it doesn't, if nothing else, you are building a new reader base in that. So, yeah, I'm doing one that should go up in November, which is the 2nd book, Through My Eyes. The 1st book, By My Hands, is there, and then I have a bunch of other books up there. So I think I've got 5 or 6 up there, including a novella and trying to think if I have any nonfiction. Oh, I have a writing nonfiction book up there.
While we're on the topic, it's not really on the topic, but we're talking about you and your writing. So I've got a student who picked up one of your books, The Scroll by you and Grant Jeffrey.
He'll get over
it. She was reading it, liked it so much she asked for it for her birthday or some such nonsense, and had a friend buy it for her. And I said, listen, friends don't let friends read Al Gansky books. That's right. So, but
lean closer so I can slap you, will you?
Okay, here we go. Right here. So, but she's enjoying it. I told her I'd share that with you, so I might as well do it on the air for everyone to hear. So they can all share in your joy and victory there. So.
That would be an interesting topic for us sometime. Collaborative writing. I've done a number of collaborative books. That's one of them. Grant Jeffrey, he passed away a few years ago, suddenly, unexpectedly. But yeah, I did a book with him, and we were in negotiations for a second book to follow that one before he passed. So that'd be a fun topic sometime.
I would love for you to do that
You've done
topic.
yeah, we handled it. Oh man, a year ago. We've been doing this almost 2 years now, haven't we? Actually, we have been doing it for 2 years, so I think we may have done it last year. So it might be good to revisit it. But yeah, we had Cindy Sproles on. She and I co-wrote a book. But Pops, it would be really good to hear your take on it because you've done it several times, and so you've got a lot of good insight that you can share with that. So.
And I just started a project that is similar to that for the first time. And so just knowing, not only would I like to hear the podcast, but now I know 2 other resources I can reach out to as I fumble my way through this.
It doesn't matter how
There
much
you go.
get.
So you're co-writing something.
I'm going to fumble through it.
Yeah. I am, Aaron.
Do you mind if I ask what you're working on? Do you mind if I ask what you're working on?
Yeah, that's okay. I was sort of approached by a former student who has done some work on a thriller novel. I've even seen portions of it in the past, but he was kind of looking for a co-author that he's kind of got the skeleton of it. He wants somebody else to, help him work through to create some other drafts, and we've had meetings. We've, discussing new characters, eliminating characters, restructuring, and I'm rewriting portions of the book, and so it somehow turned into this a co-authorship instead of more of like an editor relationship because I'm actually in there writing part of the book as well.
Excellent. Yeah, it can be very fun. It can be challenging. We'll have to do that. I'll see if we can maybe get you in on it on that podcast too. See if we have any time between now and the end of the year. But
Sure.
Yeah, it would be good to revisit that topic. We'll put that on the we'll put that on the docket next time. So, but now let's get to the topic at hand, which is the 7 deadly writing sins or the 7 deadly mistakes. And Heather, this is a topic that comes from James Frey's book, and so why don't you just kind of run it down real quick what the topic is, why you wanted to talk about it, and what these writing mistakes or writing sins might be.
Sure. Well, I've had this book for quite some time. I buy lots of craft books. This is just one I picked up at the bookstore. I think it's kind of really an underrated book. It slips through the radar a lot. I really enjoyed reading it just because it's very straightforward. And he has a whole section on the 7 deadly mistakes that writers can make. And as I was reading through them, I was a little uncomfortable to see that I felt like I was guilty of most, if not all of them, either currently or at some time since I've sort of taken up writing as a profession. And we'll talk about each one more in depth, but quickly, he talks about the 7 being writers being too timid, trying to be too literary, writing from our ego, when we failure to redream the dream, which is a great one that I'm going to want to talk about, failure to keep faith in yourself, living the wrong lifestyle, and the failure to produce. And like I said, to me this was just such a great list and such a really interesting part of the book, mainly because I felt like even though I'd gone to school, I was taking myself really seriously, I was producing work, and yet I wasn't really accomplishing the goals that I wanted. And when I started reading through this list, I really was embarrassed to see that because I'm making all of these mistakes. So I thought it might be something beneficial to share with a wider audience.
Absolutely. I think we all struggle with these and are guilty of them at some time or another, and some of them we're perpetually guilty of. I think some of them become habit if we're not careful. And what you'll find is if you Google writing mistakes, common writing mistakes, you'll see a whole range of them, and some of them will say things like don't use adjectives and adverbs, and only use said in dialogue attribution or dialogue tags, things of that nature. These are more general, they're more encompassing actually, and I like it because some of those other things can be fine-tuned. That's stuff that you can clean up with editing. These are more of a um, a larger scale, I guess you would say, and so they warrant, I think, our attention. If we can still edit and be making these mistakes, and if we're still making these mistakes as we edit, then bad things still happen. So we need to work these in. So good. We might kind of add in some of our own experiences, etc., as we go through here. Maybe some other sins that we've seen committed. But this is a pretty comprehensive list. I thought it was pretty thorough. So, Pops, what was your take on this?
Yeah, they do seem a little familiar to me. Writers go through many of the same ups and downs emotionally. Writing is an emotional thing, whether we acknowledge it or not. One day you have a lot of confidence, the next day you're pretty sure you're just producing drivel. So it's kind of up and down. So there's some good material here, I think, in this list.
Absolutely. So what's the first one about timidity? What does he mean by that? Heather.
Yeah, I like that one of the very first things he puts out there is an example of being in a writing workshop. Now, not all writers have participated in a writing workshop. If they have, it could have come in the form of formal education, if you've gone to graduate school, maybe even in your undergraduate programs. But there are writing workshops available in most communities, sometimes even through your libraries. So at some point down the road, many writers have participated in a workshop. So his first example of timidity, he talks about how it takes guts to be able to accept criticism. And that is, one part of being too timid as a writer. If we are unable to sort of sit in the hot seat and take the criticism as it comes to us, whether we can then take that criticism and use it. You can't back away from material just because, it's hard or it might offend someone either. So that's sort of the other aspect that he talks about. This willingness to take risks with your writing, to search out emotional impact. And I think that, Aaron, you and I have been in workshop together, and workshops take on different forms. And he gives an example of people like fleeing the room and throwing up or crying. And these are horror stories that I've not necessarily experienced. But I think it's really difficult as a writer to seek out criticism that isn't just praise. We all kind of want to go sit down in a workshop or pass our work to a friend to get their opinion, and it be, oh my gosh, you're such a genius. How is this not already published? This is the best thing I've ever read in my life. But I think it takes a really bold and brave writer to be able to sit in that seat and hear what is wrong with their work, and then be able to sit with that, see if they feel like it's accurate, and then go to work on the piece. How is that for you? I mean, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I've been involved in several workshops that have been pretty heated, but most of them have always been professional. There's always, the really uncomfortable ones. I was on the receiving side of that once in a poetry workshop, and I thought I had written the perfect poem, and then they spent an hour telling me how I had done nothing right at all. And that was particularly difficult. That was a tough one. My professor had absolutely no tact whatsoever. That was a tough experience for me. But then I've also had really good ones where people really like it. You were mentioning, surrounding yourself with the right people who are going to tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. And I think that's really important. I hear all the times when someone discovers that I'm a writer, they'll tell me so-and-so is working on it, but my husband or my wife or my brother or my aunt or my uncle or somebody that I know is writing a book, and it's really, really good. Like, I'm not a reader, and it's the best thing I've ever read. Okay, so you haven't read anything, and this is the only thing that you've read, so yes, it is the best thing that you've ever read. By that logic, it's also the worst thing that you've ever read. So I always consider the source. You need to find the right voices, people who are well-read, who can give you that good feedback.
It's true. And, I think that, if he lists that the timid writer being the person who doesn't seek out sort of the the true criticism of their work. He also says the timid writer is someone who backs away from material because they're afraid that it might offend someone. They're afraid of what putting a true story that they want to tell on paper. And I don't mean true in the sense of it being nonfiction events that really happened, but that story that you have brewing in you that you feel like that you want to put down on paper, but you're afraid to put it there because you're afraid of what others will think of it when they read it. You're afraid that maybe you're afraid your mother's going to read it, or your brother, or your neighbors. It's that timidity that comes with being unwilling to put whatever the story requires on the page. And I know I have faced that before. I'm sort of drawn to writing darker subject matter. I'm not really sure why, but I do feel more drawn to that. And that was really hard for me early on to kind of give myself permission to write whatever I wanted to write, what I felt like I needed to write, even if I used inappropriate language or violent situations. It was sort of okay for me to do that.
I agree. And that's so new writers are typically timid, and it takes them a while to learn that you have to do what the story demands. Pops, I don't know, do you have any experience with timid writing? Do you remember a time when you were timid in your prose before you kind of gained the confidence? Or as being a professional reading other people's work, are there telltale signs where you can tell a writer is being timid?
I'm not usually accused of being timid. You want to know the truth. I solved the problem. I just beat up the first person that was criticized my work, and then after that, no one else would criticize it. So,
well, there you go.
Yeah, if you do that with enough violence, they just stop criticizing you. The key here is who is it that's doing the criticism? In our writers' conference, you can sign up to get a critique, and you're getting a professional to look at it. We don't get people together and all these other would-be writers and those that are coming up through the ranks to criticize someone else's work, because it's my feeling most of the time they don't know what they're talking about. They might know what they like and they don't like, but to give advice, then it gets a little iffy. So I'm the kind of person who shies away from that group get together and let's criticize each other's work. Always understand who it is that's doing the critique on your work. Do they have the qualifications? So in your case, Aaron, your professor is an expert in poetry and he had negative stuff to take. Well, you have to listen to that. Doesn't necessarily mean he's right, but you have to give it enough weight to say, well, I need to look at this and see if he's right. Then there are those who will be critics that have, every once in a while I'll get an email from somebody that'll criticize something. You're a better writer than this, you should know better than this, and then they've got 15 problems in the email. Usually they like to pick out the misspelling or something like that. And they're just people who are very, very negative, and they can't praise without putting something negative in it. So ask yourself, who is it that's doing this? Do they have any experience? Have they written any books? Have they gone to school for this? Or do they just think that they have the experience? And you take the experienced ones, the professionals, seriously. The others you take with a grain of salt.
The last thing that... Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Heather.
No, I was just sort of moving us on to the last point of his examples, where he said that, the last way in which that a writer can be timid is timid in the promotion of their own work. That, once we've put something down on the page, we've made it as good as we can. The next part of being a writer is then getting your work out into the world. And that's an area of which writers can also be timid, is in the promotion of their work.
Now that I have experience in.
I would agree. I'm not timid there. See, and it's funny, I don't think I'm timid at all. I just say, please do this for me. I boldly ask Molly to do all that for me. So, but otherwise, I am very timid in promoting my own work.
But self-promotion here. He bought me the plate to put it on.
Yeah.
I have a plate,
I did.
so you can keep
I
keeping it
did.
up.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Heather, number two, the those who you're trying to be too literary.
Yes, and ooh, is this one that I have some experience with? Yeah, he says that there are those writers that are trying to be too literary. And he says oftentimes they're fledgling writers that are kind of maybe coming out of a grad school workshop or someone who's maybe read a lot of literary novels, and they're just spending a lot of time trying to emulate other literary writers, literary giants. I mean, people think they're going to be the next David Foster Wallace or maybe a James Joyce. And they're trying so desperately to sort of be cutting edge or different or, like I said, or emulating a particular writer that essentially they're kind of forgetting to focus on being a good storyteller first. They're too literary often means trying to break all the rules before you've even learned them in the first place.
I once had been hired to help rewrite a book, and the author that I was working with did that. I would make changes. I was doing a line edit, which means you're altering the lines, the sentence structure, and I was going through it, and it needed a lot of work. And then finally, he would put it all back. And when I asked him about it, his response was, "Well, I like Faulkner. I want to write like Faulkner." And I had to tell him, "Well, there's really two things you need to know. Faulkner wrote in the 20s. He's dead, and you're not even getting close. No one writes like him." And so you need to stop trying to do that, or you need to get someone else to do this because it's not working. And there is this myth that the literary writers started off literary. They set out to be literary, and I'm not sure that's true. Hemingway, I don't think, ever wanted to be a literary writer. He wanted to tell a good story. And his writings is nothing like Faulkner, nothing like any of the other people writing during that time. So
I think the key with that is you just hit it. Is that I think in the case of a lot of these literary writers, they were there to tell a story, and their particular style was the way in which they were writing. Where now we have writers who are trying to emulate the style ahead of the story. The style, so they're focusing on style at the expense of the story and the reader. Sort of that putting the cart before the horse. They're focusing on the style and the story second, where I think if you're looking at a Hemingway or a Faulkner or a James Joyce, I think that the style in which they were writing is what came natural to them. They weren't emulating anyone. They weren't trying hard to do anything. That's just the way in which their writing of their own personal style came about when they went to tell a story. So I think that anytime that you're trying to be an imitator of other writers, instead of creating sort of a fresh work, you're sort of missing the point. It doesn't mean that there isn't something to be learned from studying other writers, playing around with your style, even trying to copy some of these styles as you're developing your own. But this is more of like the work you do behind closed doors, not the type of work that you're trying to put out in the world as your own.
I did have this issue when writing The Bargain, which I wrote while I was at Antioch University, and I desperately wanted to show how intelligent I was. And I got several rejection letters from publishers that said, "We love this book, but it's too literary," which I immediately took as a badge of honor. And look at me, I'm too literary for all these peons, and I thought I was just super awesome. And it wasn't until I revisited the book for another revision when I realized I had put style in front of story, and I had compromised several parts of the story for the sake of style, and that cost me a lot of contracts. There were several publishers who backed out of contracts because they weren't really comfortable with it, and I was just simply trying to put in every huge word that I knew and try and learn some new ones to impress people with my vocabulary, and it didn't work that well. I had to kind of go back through and make it more approachable and just more tangible, more real. People had to speak the way they actually speak rather than everybody sounding as if they had a PhD. So it's an easy trap to fall into when you want to impress the reader with your writing rather than impressing them with the story. Story comes first, and then impress them with your writing as well. But don't sacrifice story for the sake of style. I like the way that you say that. Thanks for bearing with me, by the way, for those of you. Sorry, I popped off for a little bit and popped back on, and hopefully we've got some issues fixed now. So, Pops.
Well, now I'm totally lost. I'm old, that little gap there. I just lost everything. Let me know. I think I remember now. Let me ask you this and see if you agree with this. Should the story dictate the voice and the style? I know people talk about having a writing style, but does that mean we have to have the same style through all the books that we write? Or can the story say, all right, I want to be different. I want to be first person, and I want to take a different kind of tone, and than, say, the last book or the next book?
I would say yes. I think style is dictated by story, or at least it should be. I'm thinking of Cormac McCarthy right now, and he's got a very distinctive style. But when you read The Road, it is not the same book as No Country for Old Men, and it's not the same book as Blood Meridian. They're just completely different works. But you can tell his particular style. You can tell his voice. You can tell the way characters speak. And there's a lot of variations with how characters speak, those who are educated versus those who are uneducated, where they come from in the country, dialect, things of that nature. He's just a master at that. I think that there are some similarities between The Bargain and Hand of Adonai in context of prose, but they're completely different books, and they read in different ways. Reading them, you can't read them really the same way. And so I think that style should be dictated by story, yes. Heather, would you agree with that?
I would, absolutely. I think even in my own writing, I've noticed that in the first book that I was working on, I, much like you, began working on it at Antioch. And a lot of the feedback that I got early on as well was, too literary. But the story that I was telling at the time, I also felt, as you said, that the story sort of dictated that type of style of writing, per se. The novel of my own that I'm working on, the style is slightly different because I have a different voice, as Alton said. Like I have a different character. It's a completely different sort of style of story. So the style, it's written in a different style as well. And I especially notice this now that I'm sort of jumping into this co-writing or co-authoring venture, because it's a political thriller. There are nuclear bombs and Russian mafia and all sorts of things. And so my typical style of maybe writing with longer sentences and using semicolons, it's not the style that this genre of book calls for. I'm writing much more direct sentences, much shorter. It's moving at a completely different pace, and my style of writing is entirely different.
Absolutely. But still uniquely Heather Luby. And I've read several of your short stories, and I can say that
Am I in there?
you're there. You wrote them all. This story by Heather Luby was by Heather Luby, and this one by Heather Luby also by Heather Luby.
By Heather Luby.
Yeah, so it's shocking. But you do have your voice. The voice does change, but your style, there are some consistencies throughout, and a lot of it's sentence structures and semantics and how you approach figurative language and things of that nature. But there's enough variation there from project to project. That's why we have our favorite authors, because there is some similarity throughout, but the best authors understand how to change that. Stephen King books, even though several of them have the same kind of subject matter, the way that they're handled, especially the characters, are handled differently, and he's very good at that. So yeah, absolutely. So don't fall into the trap of sacrificing story for style. Always make sure that your style is serving the story.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And number 3 is ego writing. What does he mean by this?
He says that with ego writing, it's usually those type of writers who really can't be open to criticism. And this isn't the same as the timid writer. This is sort of the opposite. This is the writer who kind of believes that they get their writing, and if there's a reader out there who doesn't get it, well, it's totally the reader's fault. It's because they're not, smart enough to understand their genius, or they don't get, the parallels they were drawing, etc. This is the person that is, when I say writing solely for themselves, I don't mean it in the way that that we should expect writers to be writing for whatever's popular at the time. We should, in an extent, be telling the stories that we need to tell as writers for us, and then putting them in the world. But the eco-writer is someone who is all about pleasing themselves with their own work. So you need to be about pleasing the reader and not your ego, if that makes sense. I thought that was a really great line. Pleasing the reader, not your ego.
Well, if you have an audience of one, and you are that one, you can please 100% of your audience all the time, and that's fine. I tell my students, if you want to write for yourself, that's great. Keep it to yourself. That's for you. That's not for anybody else.
Right, that's what journals are for.
Exactly. That's why Jesus made journals. But I did this. As a matter of fact, you're kind of hitting kind of close to home, because that was the poetry workshop. I wrote a poem that was going to demonstrate my genius and how unbelievably brilliant I was, and I had written the perfect poem, and shockingly, no, it wasn't perfect, and they all sat there and said, "There's really nothing good about this poem at all," and that was kind of hard to hear. And then looking back at it, at the end of my workshop, I said, well, this is what I was trying to accomplish. And everybody said, yeah, first of all, no, you didn't. And second of all, why would you want to? That's just, you're trying too hard. And so that was a tough lesson for me. The next workshop that I did went over very well, and everybody loved it, and they said it was one of the best poems they'd read, and blah, blah, blah. Well, what I had done there is I'd just taken a more natural approach, and I didn't try to be super fancy. I just tried to write a poem. I had the idea and I wanted to write it, and I did. And so I think when I was trying to write more within myself rather than to please myself, the outcome was better. Pops, you have any experience like this? You got some ego writing from back in your college days?
Well, I do see a lot of it. I don't have an ego anymore. I was in the ministry too long to have an ego anymore. That was been beaten out of me. So no, I don't. I want my work to be liked, but I don't write for myself. I sometimes fabricate stories in my mind that might be fun to write, and I enjoy them, but they never go anyplace. I don't put them on paper unless I think there's going to be some benefit to the reader about that. But I do meet a lot of people that they want to be a writer because they think it makes them famous. And that they'll be loved, and I don't think any of that really applies. We write the story because it needs to be written. Sure,
you're kind of crushing me right now, Al.
Am I crushing you? You want to be famous?
I want to be famous. I want to be loved.
Well, you are loved.
I want to be famous more.
Yeah, well, who doesn't? But the IRS wants you to be more famous too, because they like that extra money.
Okay, never mind. I can't.
That's the wrong. It's the wrong motivation. Sometimes what we have to get writers to understand is this is art, and you need to love the art, and that's why you do it. And if it catches on, it catches on. No one knows why a book sells. No one knows why it becomes a bestseller. I've had several agents, and I'd get comments from some of my earlier agents, well, you need to write a book like Dan Brown. You need to write another Da Vinci Code. I think it's already been done. What would you see it's different? I don't know. You need to write one like that, though, that'll sell like that. Well, why didn't that occur to me? It didn't occur to me to write a best-selling book. I wanted to write a loser. And the point is, no one knows. Some of the books that become bestsellers are a surprise to everyone. We've talked about Jerry Jenkins' Left Behind series. It's a co-written thing. He just thought it was another co-writing job. He wrote the first one. I think it was a 2-book deal. He wrote the first, he wrote the second, and he thought, well, that's the end of that, and he moved on to the next project, and then it became an international crossover bestseller, and he's the most surprised guy on the planet. It also made him wealthy, but he didn't see that coming, and he wrote 100 books before he got to that. He'd written over 100 books before he got to it. So
be patient. Be patient. I'm almost there. 98 more novels to go, and So I'm preparing for wealth right now. You got to plan ahead. So the fourth sin here, the failure to redream the dream. This is kind of an interesting one. What does that mean exactly, Heather?
This was probably my favorite one. He was saying the failure to redream the dream is about sort of our willingness to really engage in the craft of writing. Not only this aspect of letting your work be criticized, right? But then really examining our work in revision and discovering what is necessary in order to make it work, to make it be successful. And he said that often requires what he calls redreaming. It is mean as a writer, we have to have a willingness to let our stories that we've put on paper, even our large works, our novels of 300 plus pages, change shape. New objectives emerge. So instead of only seeing a work as having only its original framework, its original characters and plot lines, we have to realize that sometimes once we've gotten that first draft down on paper, we might need to replace some of those original ideas with better ideas, right? Maybe you thought you were writing about one thing, but by the time you got to the end of the book, it would be better if you were writing about what had been the adjacent story. Maybe the subplot is the thing that really is the thing you should be writing about. And we really have to be willing, to do those necessary characters, right? To not think of our work as like a memory in our head that we're, transcribing down on paper, not something that's fixed in time, but rather write it as if it has endless possibilities and we're trying to find the best one.
I like that. I remember hearing Brett Anthony Johnston talk about writing a story about a boy who goes fishing, and you think the story is about the boy who's going fishing, but by the end of the story you realize you've been writing about the fish the whole time. So what do? You go back and you throw it away and you start again to write about the boy? No. You go back and you revise the beginning to highlight the fact that you're writing about the fish. And that kind of always stuck with me. For me, that Redreaming the Dream was the Hand of Adonai series, which originally started as a standalone book, and for various reasons. But I decided I was going to do a standalone book so that, I don't know, I thought it would be easier. And when I got to the end, I realized this is really in that in-between. There's a lot of stuff that I want to cover that I didn't get to. So Redreaming the Dream for me at that point was turning it from a standalone into a larger series that I've been working on pretty much ever since. Enjoying it, by the way, but I had to redream the dream, and I would be super, super sad if I hadn't done that. If I had just left it as a standalone, I know I would not have been happy with it. I would have been mildly pleased, but I would not be as happy with it as I currently am, and excited for it, really, really excited for it. How about you, Pops?
I've had a couple of experiences like that. As you were talking, when it occurred to me, I wrote a book called Enoch, and just so everyone knows, the Old Testament lists two people who never died. One was Enoch, one was Elijah. The story of Enoch is very short. It's one verse. It says, Enoch walked with God, and Enoch was no more, for God took him. And so for a writer, that is, ooh, what would happen if I brought him back? And so I did. And plopped him down in contemporary times. And so I'm writing this story about this Old Testament prophet who comes back into a world he doesn't understand. His first new revelation is that he's wearing an odd brand of tennis shoes, and he doesn't even know what that is. New Balance tennis shoes, I think it was. Well, the point of all this is I struggled through the first part of that book. And I had a minor storyline. He encounters different people, and one tried to beat him up. And I had to finish that story with this young, violent guy who attacks Enoch, or tries to attack Enoch. And I thought, well, I've got to finish that up, because what happens? Well, they both get tossed in jail. All right, I got to wind up the thing. How would Enoch treat this guy? And then what happens to the guy? Well, I got to write one more scene in which he's out of jail and something happens. And I could not shake that character. He would not go away. And so there was always one more scene. One more scene, I got to touch that up. And then I realized the book was about him. I had it backwards. And I don't know, I was probably over 100 pages into it before I realized I was writing the wrong book. I had the wrong protagonist. The supporting protagonist was Enoch. The real protagonist was this other guy, and that's why he would not go away. He knew better than I did. So I had to redream the whole thing, and I think it turned out to be a much better book, and it became a lot easier to write. Then I had to do that with A Ship Possessed. I sent the proposal in, and I had the story all figured out. I'll have to tell this very quickly. There's a longer story to it, but I used to do multi-book proposals, and then I'd have a sheet of other ideas I'm working on, just so the editor, the acquisitions editor, could say, that interests me, send me something on that. Always give them a reason to say yes. And the last one I had on there was a thing called A Ship Possessed. It's really about a submarine. A Ship Possessed, and I only put it on there because I had too much white space at the bottom of the page. I didn't like to look. So I put it on there, and I wrote 2 lines and sent it off, and the editor from the publisher calls, and he says, now this Ship Possessed, is that still available? Sure. Always going to be sure. Sure. He says, well, can you send me a full proposal on that? Be glad to do it. Because I'd like to see what you're thinking here and how it works out. I had no idea. I spent 2 nights awake in bed staring at the ceiling going, how can I have a possessed submarine? How's that work? What's that mean? And 2 sleepless nights later, I came up with a story, put it in the proposal, sent it off. They bought it. I started the book and realized it was a really stupid story. And so I changed it. I changed it dramatically, and the editor liked it, but I did get a little note from him that said, it's not nice to fool your editor. And that still bugs me. I really feel bad about that. Guilt is the gift that keeps on giving. But I was able to reimagine that whole thing again, and it became a better book. It's still selling, really. So
it's a good book. It's one of my favorites that you've done.
And I think that this is essential because I don't know that I have talked to many writers who haven't put a first draft on paper that there isn't some aspect of it, whether it be major or minor, but that didn't require some redreaming, some flexibility, some willingness to say, you know, this story is not written in stone. Even those writers that I know who are outliners, I wouldn't say to 100%, but there's a great deal of them that say, you know, the outline is still a fluid thing. It still changes. It still gets reimagined as I go and as I revise. And I think that that's, you know, it's really important if you're going to grow as a writer in terms of craft to be willing to do that sort of hard work.
It's essential. It really is essential. And this is where writers get, you know, the white coats coming after them. The story exists on its own, and I say things to my class like you really are the conduit for the story. You're not really the teller of the story. The story exists there. It's your job to discover it and figure it out and find it and put it on paper. And the characters are not your own. And well, yeah, they are. I'm writing it. No, but they don't belong to you. They are their own people. And once a writer becomes comfortable with that, I think that's when stories really start to take off and really become something fantastic. And we all dream first, but writing is really that act of redreaming and not being so committed to your work as it stands. You need to be committed to the work as it should be, as it can be, the best possible version of it that you can come up with. It takes commitment to that. Yeah.
Well, that kind of leads us really well into the fifth, which was the failure to keep faith in yourself, which I think, you know, a lot of, pretty much all writers probably recognize to a degree, right? And this happens, you know, because this hard work, right, becomes discouraging to us in some way, because life gets in the way. Maybe discouragement comes in the form of rejection or envy as we see other writers doing better than us. Maybe we just get distracted, but one way or another, we just slowly lose faith in our ability as a writer, as someone who's going to be successful at it. I think my favorite line of this entire section of his book came when he says that the danger is when you begin to think of yourself as somebody who will someday be a writer. Someday be a writer, instead of someone who's a writer right now. Because I teach adults a lot at community college, there are so many students in my class who come to me who say, well, you know, I was sort of busy with life. But now that I'm retired, now that my kids have moved away, now I might find the time to be a writer. And, you know, sort of getting such a late jump. They spent their whole life thinking that they had a story to tell, but they would just do it someday. And I think it's mainly because, you know, they didn't have the faith in themselves at the time to do it.
You know, one of the best pieces of writing advice I ever heard came from a writers' conference, and I probably don't even remember the exact words, but it was something to the effect of, if you want to be a writer, but you don't introduce yourself as a writer, you don't refer to yourself as a writer, you don't think of yourself as a writer, you'll never be a writer. So when you're sitting on the plane and somebody says, what do you do? If I say I'm a teacher, I'm not a writer. I have to at least, if nothing else, say I'm a teacher and a writer. I've got to include that in there. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of twisted that a little bit, adapted it when I was at speaking on a panel of writers to the California Writers Club. And the question was, what advice would you give an aspiring writer? And my advice is to stop calling yourself aspiring. Mm-hmm. Just get rid of it. You're a writer. Be a writer. And if you say aspiring, that gives yourself license to not write, because, hey, I'm only aspiring. Well, stop aspiring and be a writer. And you never will be unless you do it. So you've got to make sure that you're getting that done. So it's very, very important to think of yourself as a writer, not as somebody who will someday be a writer. I like the way you spin that. Yeah, we're getting kind of close here on time. I don't know if we're able to hit 6 and 7 real fast.
I think we can. Okay. Number 6, he says, and this is a really all too common one, especially for me, which is the living the wrong lifestyle as a writer. So you're right, we can claim ourselves as writers, but then it really comes down to, are we making the choices and the sacrifices and the decisions in our life that then support us being a writer? And he lists many ways in which people are leading the wrong lifestyle as a writer. For instance, he says if you have a job, right, that is not writing, that's fine. A lot of us do. But if that job becomes the center of your life instead of writing, if it becomes something more than what just pays the bills, but it is the thing that rules you, then you're leading the wrong lifestyle. If you're unwilling or unable to organize your life around your writing, then you're leading the wrong lifestyle. He makes the point that, you know, the lawn can wait. You can get groceries later. You can make those phone calls, you know, after your writing time has expired, for instance, so that whenever you sit down to write, whenever you designate as your writing time, you protect it. This made me think a lot of one of my favorite quotes by the writer Richard Bausch. I actually have it on a t-shirt. And it says, writing is not an indulgence. The indulgences are what you give up in order to write. And I think that that sums up number 6 perfectly. If you are treating writing as if it is this hobby, that it's an indulgence, it's something that you kind of get to every once in a while to treat yourself, then you're leading the wrong lifestyle. You should be organizing everything else in your life to fit you as a writer, not the other way around.
Writing as a hobby means writing is not a profession. There's a difference between a hobby and a profession. Yeah, well said.
And the last was the failure to produce. Now, I don't know about you, Aaron, but you know, now that I'm a lot better at carving out really specific time for my writing. But, you know, let's say if I'm going to write from 10 to 3 every day, I do have a habit of, well, it's 10. I need a good fresh cup of coffee first. Well, and while I'm waiting on the coffee pot to finish brewing, I'll go ahead and unload the dishwasher. And maybe I can go ahead and start a load of laundry, because why not have the laundry going while I'm writing? That just seems more efficient. And then the telephone rings, and I notice that it's my dad. I don't really have time to talk to him, but then I think, well, but what if he really needs something? So I should pick that up. And then the next thing I know, it's like, 11:15, and I think, well, I'm getting kind of hungry. Should I sit down and write, or should I go ahead and eat lunch first? Well, let me go ahead and eat lunch first. And then I eat lunch, and then I think, well, I just ate. Maybe I want to see what's on Facebook, and you see where this is going, right?
I see. Yes. It all sounds so familiar to me.
So at some point I will get writing done, but I end up getting maybe an hour and a half out of writing accomplished when I'd really blocked out hours and hours worth of writing. But between the coffee breaks and the bathroom breaks and the phone calls and let me pay this bill really fast and so on and so forth, I realize that I'm not really producing at the speed that I need to.
Right. And that's the big thing, the production. You can't publish a book you haven't written. And so you've got to stop playing games with yourself, and you've got to be honest with yourself and say, my butt's not in the chair. I need to fix that. And we've talked about how to do that before. It might warrant another podcast topic to talk about that. One of the other issues of not producing work is writer's block, which a lot of people struggle with. And so we did one quite a while ago on writer's block and how to handle that. We'll probably revisit that again as well sometime soon as well. But one of the big things here in the show notes, Pops, you've got down Isaac Asimov's 3 typewriters, and that's kind of an interesting story, if you don't mind sharing that with our listeners.
Sure. Isaac Asimov holds the record for, I think, the most books in print. Most of us think of him as a science fiction writer, but he preferred writing nonfiction, and that's where he made most of his money. Was in writing nonfiction. But you read his biography and stuff, he talks about a particular typewriter, but he's been on record as saying he used to keep 3 typewriters, and he would just write and write and write. He loved to write, and he'd write and write, but if he hit a block, couldn't come up with the next thing, or had to find some more information, he would rotate his chair, put his hands on the next typewriter, and whatever that project was, he would start typing. Wow. And he would work on that until the other problem solved itself, or he ran out of steam on that one, and he'd turn his chair to the third one. And he just kept cranking out 3. He was probably quite literally a genius in many ways. But that's what he did. He just kept things going. And that was his life, his writing. He didn't like to go out much. He liked to stay in his apartment and crank out work. And so anytime he hit a block, he just changed typewriters until it cleared.
So
I give that advice a lot when I'm teaching, because I get asked that question all the time by students, and I'm like, it's okay to have multiple projects. If you are someone who constantly feels like they get stuck, change it up. Leave the novel for a few days and work on a nonfiction essay, or work on a poem, or work on a play, and then if you've given yourself a day or 2 break, then go back with fresh eyes, and almost always you'll be ready to jump right back in.
And I would add to that, a friend of mine, Angela Hunt, who was on the last episode that we did, the last cast, she would sometimes write what was called a blast copy. She'd just start in the beginning and go to the end, but if she came across something she couldn't figure out, she'd just make a note of it, and that's what she would type in. I need something here that does this, and then she'd move on to the next scene she had, and she just kept going and going. And then sometimes, a day or 2 down, she'd go, oh, I know what needs to go in there, and she had it marked, so she went back and put it in. And lets the subconscious do some work, and lets it percolate. And that works very well. It's okay in your first draft, skip it. Or write junk. If it's, well, boy, this isn't coming out the way I want it to. You don't care. Just keep going. You can fix it later. And because that's a different part of the brain, and you'd be surprised how well that works in getting stuff done.
Can't revise something that's not written.
That's right.
In all of that, what I heard was that I need to have 3 computers, so to be a productive writer. So I'm going to talk with Naomi after the show and just let her know, hey, if you want me selling books, 3 computers. So I don't know if that's going to work or not.
Yeah, you see with computers, though, they're different than typewriters. You only need one to do several projects. I'll explain this to you later, Aaron. Never mind. Your wife will explain this to you.
Yeah. So, well, we are very quickly running out of time. Molly, the room's been fairly active tonight.
Yeah.
Any questions, comments, concerns?
Well, let me start at the bottom and work my way up. Basically, just a whole lot of support and conversations. They really enjoyed all of it. Checking in there. We had a full room tonight, so that was really exciting. Awesome. We were talking about the critique groups, and some people were sharing their stories of, yeah, they've been in critique groups that have pretty much made them cry, but overall they think critique groups are a good thing. Different projects. Maya Good says she has a dream project. She's not ready to be bare enough to write it, so she's put it aside and works on other projects to build a stronger skin first. I think I like that, actually, because at least she's headed toward that goal of knowing what's coming next. So that's pretty decent. Just going through comments, confused by the term literary. We cleared that up. Okay. Let's see. Jenny Snow says she's been with her writing group for years. They were so kind to her and made her feel like she had talent, even if the work didn't start out that great. She likes the Oreo method of finding something positive to offer criticism and then finishing it off with another something positive. Becky told her that that's actually called the sandwich approach, but we prefer to call it the Oreo approach.
But then that makes the cream filling the bad part, and I can't see that analogy working.
So just for you, we'll change it back
to the sandwich method. Liverwurst sandwich. The liverwurst, nobody wants that. It's like a Spam sandwich. You just
I actually really like liverwurst, so.
Okay, well, I apologize. Retract.
Yeah. I'm going, there's so many comments. It was really great. Not a lot of questions. A lot of people really loved what you guys were talking about. Heather, you got a lot of +1s on comments and shout outs. Aaron, people think you're mean to your dad.
What?
You're just
Preach it.
This is outrageous.
I'm telling you, Al, they are on Team Al tonight. Let me just say.
I'm just a poor old writer, unloved by family.
We got to get shirts that say Team Al and Team Aaron. We need that. I have a feeling that the Team Aaron would not sell.
Can I wear one that says Team Aaron and Team Al?
Team FIF. How about that? Team.
Okay, I can do that. Talking about support of the lifestyle and having the right people around you and liking the idea of having several projects going at once. It was all just really informative tonight. A lot of great comments.
That tends to happen a lot when Heather's on, so.
I've noticed.
Yay!
Yay for Heather.
Yeah.
I've done something right today. You know, I chaperoned a first grade field trip to the zoo for the bulk of my day, and then I went and I coached. And then I went and I coached 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade girls at Girls on the Run this afternoon, and I came home and made dinner. And so this was so nice today to talk with adults about writing. I don't have to remind any of you to use the bathroom or wash your hands.
Oh, that reminds me.
Oh, gotta go.
So excellent. Well, we've really enjoyed having you on. And so, Heather, why don't you tell our listeners how they can get some more of the good Heather and where they can find you online?
I'm super easy to find. You can go to my website, which is heatherluby.com. You'll find links there to anywhere I'm at on social media. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram. But you can find all of that at heatherluby.com.
Excellent. And Molly, how can people get in touch with you?
Mostly on my blog, which is franklymydearmojo.com. I have all my other contact information up there, other links and websites. So. Or I'm also all over Facebook.
You are, yeah. And if you want to get a hold of Molly, you can also contact me through Facebook, and she'll see it. So,
yep.
For the most part. Pops has mysteriously dropped out of the pod. Oh, and it looks like he's coming back. So he just wanted to be like me and drop out of the podcast and make his big entrance.
I think maybe Heather's reminder that he had to go use the bathroom or something. I don't know.
It was mysteriously timed. Yeah. Pops, are you back with us yet? We've got his image, but we don't have his audio. So I will inform you how to get in touch with him. BRMCWC stands for Blue Ridge Mountain Christian Writers Conference, is where he does most of his blogging and talks about his writers' conferences that he puts together and what do you call it? Coordinates, I guess, directs. There we go, conference director. And so you can find a lot of good writing about writing at brmcwc.com. And you can always find me at aarongansky.com. And so we thank you all for listening. And until next week, good writing.